Hey, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and in this video, I'm going to show you how to create a dynamic image accordion using Oxygen's repeater element. What we've got here is a repeater that is querying posts, and it's showing the post's featured image as the image in our accordion. It starts out with a primary image focused, but if we click one of these other images, it goes ahead and expands out, and the other ones shrink to make room. We've also got dynamic links here. We can click the post title down here, which is pulled dynamically, and go view the post. Now, to give credit where it's due, Supa Mike from oxygenforfun.supadesign.com created a tutorial about an element like this quite a while ago. So go check that out if you want to see a slightly different approach. This one's actually reactive on hover instead of on click and just works a little bit differently than my setup. And in fact, my setup pulls more inspiration from this code pen that I found by a user named Z-, where you have this icon, some text, and then these clickable images that expand out. This was kind of the pattern that I followed while building this element out. So with all that being said, let's jump into Oxygen and get started building this thing. The first thing we're going to need is a section to put everything inside of, and then we're going to need a repeater. And this repeater is definitely going to need a class, so let's add a class like image accordion. And then the div itself is going to need a class, the repeater div that is. So repeater div, we're going to select that div and go in and give it a class of image accordion item. And then within that, we're going to have yet another div, and we'll call this image accordion details. And this is where our icon and our text and things are going to live. So let's go ahead and drop in the content into this. Let's do an icon. And we can add a class here, image accordion __ icon. Before we style it up too much, I always like to get my classes in place and my structure in place. So let's drop in our text link here, which is going to be linked to the post's permalink. All right, we can go ahead and set that up actually. We'll choose permalink, and then we'll insert in the actual text itself the title of the post. So now we have our basic structure set up. We have our divs, which are basically our images because we're going to add the image to the background of these divs. We have this div, which is going to contain our icon and our clickable links. One more thing we are going to need is a code block because we're going to do a little bit of custom CSS and a tiny bit of custom JavaScript. So I'm going to drop that above the repeater, and let's just clear out this PHP and HTML that we do not need. All right, we're all set up to start styling. Let's start in on the repeater first. I know that I want to query posts, but I do not want any pagination. So I don't want any next, previous, 1, 2, 3, 4 links at the bottom. So I'm going to use an advanced query here and edit it. And I'm going to search for post type and drop that in, add a value, and that's going to be post. Then I'm going to add another parameter, which is posts per page, drop that in, add a value, that's going to be 5. This element is going to be built basically to handle about 5 images. Now we're going to go down here and add another parameter, and we're going to use something called no found rows, and we're going to add a value of true. This is going to ensure we get 5 posts with no pagination. So if we apply that, you should see we now have 5 items being returned. Now on this repeater still, we're going to go to advanced layout. We're going to set it to flex. We're going to do a row direction and center everything. Align items and justify content should both be centered. And that's pretty much it for the repeater for now. Now we need to go down to our image accordion item here and adjust some styles here. We are going to need to go ahead and set the background image from the featured image of the post that's being returned. So we'll go over to the ID to do that and set data and choose featured image and insert it. Now you can see we got our background images here. We're going to go ahead and center those by setting them to 50% left and 50% top. That already looks a bunch better. Now these are going to need a height, so let's go to the class again since we can set everything else on the class, and we'll go to size and spacing and set a height of something like 400 pixels. And then we're also going to want to set this to layout, position relative because we'll probably absolutely position our little detail div over here. And speaking of which, let's move on to that. Let's go to advanced layout and set it to position absolute. And actually, it may be a bit early to start doing that. As you can see, everything kind of collapses because it has no width once that item is set to absolute. So we'll do that here in a minute once we set up some of our other items here. So let's jump over to our code block and start getting into some of our custom CSS. So we had some classes here. It was image, accordion, item. I think this is the main one we need to work with here. And we need to set that to flex grow 1. And then we're going to have another class that gets added via JavaScript. And this is going to be image, accordion, item, -- active. And we'll set this to flex grow 10. So let's check on that real quick. Let's make sure that that lets us go ahead and absolutely position this now that they have the flex grow value. Go to layout, go to absolute, and that's much, much better. And let's do a bottom of 16 pixels and a left of 16 pixels. And we're going to want to jump over to primary and align everything horizontally and then center everything vertically. Now we do need one more class, which I missed, which is going to be the class for this link. And we're going to add a class called image accordion link. That'll let us target that a little bit easier when we get into our custom CSS stuff because we want to hide that when the image it belongs to is not active. Now, we also need to set a width on this. So let's go to size and spacing and set a width of something like 200 pixels or so to get it not on 3 lines like it was. And then on the left margin, let's give it 16 pixels. Now let's get into styling this icon. We're going to set it to solid. We're going to set the icon size to something like 32, I think, and then reduce the space around the icon to 8 pixels or so. And we're going to change the icon color to like an orangish red, which we had in the demo. And then we want kind of a double right chevron thing. So let's look for chev. Nope. Let's check and see if we can find this in the list real quick. I believe it is coming up. There it is, and drop that in. So that's basically our details. Now that we have that set up, we can go back to our code block and add another line of CSS, which what we want to do is do image accordion item not image accordion item active. So we're basically saying if the image accordion item does not have the image accordion item active class, we want to target a child of that, which is going to be the image accordion link. Now we should be able to go in and set this to opacity 0. Now what we're going to have to do is make sure that that has an opacity of 1 when the image accordion item does have that active class. So we'll just do image accordion link and we'll set the opacity to 1. And then let's add a transition. Transition 0.3 seconds, opacity, ease in, out. So let's apply that. And I always like to take a peek on the front end to see how everything's panning out as I start to work. And you can see that now we have everything kind of laid out properly, but we're missing our links because guess what? None of these have that active class. So it's of course not going to show up. That's perfect. That's right where we want to be. Now, one other thing we're going to have to do to make sure we don't interfere with our JavaScript is we're going to grab this selector, which is our not active selector essentially. And we're going to target the image accordion details div. And when our image or our parent div is not active, meaning it doesn't have the image accordion item active class there, then we're going to set the details div to pointer events none. That means the link can't be clicked, and clicks on other elements within that should not interact negatively with our JavaScript. And while I'm thinking about it, let's drop this editor theme to something a bit more visible. And jump up here and let's make sure, yep, we can no longer click those invisible links. Now that's about it for the CSS. We may have to revisit some of this to tweak some of the styling, but for now, let's jump over to the JavaScript, which is actually remarkably simple. We're only going to need about 20 lines or so. And some of those are just because I'm using vanilla JavaScript instead of jQuery. If you want to use jQuery, you could probably do it in far fewer lines. So first we're going to create a document ready callback. So var ready callback. This is just the vanilla JavaScript way of firing something when the document's loaded. If document.readyState does not equal loading, then we're going to do our callback. Else document.addEventListener DOM content loaded callback. So that's basically going to tell our script to fire our ready function when everything's loaded. So we'll go to the next line and create that ready function, which is going to be ready. It's going to be an arrow function. And first things first, if window.angular return. You've probably seen me do this before. This makes sure that this script does not run in the builder environment because it can tend to throw some errors here and there. Now, what we need to do when the document first loads is we need to make that first image element active. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to do document.querySelector all, and then we're going to target image accordion __ item first child. So we're only going to grab the image accordion items when they are the first child in their parent, which should just work perfectly with our setup. Then for each one of those, we're going to run another function. And within that, we're going to add our active class to this item. So first is the reference to the item we found. We're going to go to class list.add, and then we're going to add that active class, image-accordion __ item -- active. Now there's a real possibility I've typoed something here, so I may have to go back and fix that to make sure it works, but if I haven't, that should add that active class to the first item. And right here, I get an alert that I did in fact miss something here. So let's add that arrow and then jump to the front end and make sure that active class is being added here. It is, but the mistake I made here, which is really easy to do, is I added a period when I was adding something to the class list, which I do not need to do. JavaScript knows that this is a class. It just needs to add the class name. The period is not necessary in this case. So let's refresh, and we should now see that it is active. Okay, so it looks exactly how we want it to, but there's no click functionality yet, right? So that's the next thing that we need to do. So let's jump into our JavaScript and add that. So we need to add a click event listener to all of our image accordion items. So we're going to do document.querySelector all, and then we're looking for image-accordion __ item. And then again, we're going to run a for each item. And then for each of these items, well, first, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to do if window.angular return. Again, that's to keep this script from running inside of Oxygen. If you're just writing this elsewhere, writing this as a standalone JavaScript thing, you don't need to worry about that. Now, for each item, we need to add event listener. We're listening for a click, and then we're running a function. So we're going to pass in the event object because we're going to need that to do some targeting wizardry here. And the first thing we need to do is we don't want more than one active item. So when we click an item, we need to remove the active class from all the items that have that class. So the way we can do that is we can do event.target, which gives us the item we've clicked, which then lets us traverse to the parent by doing parent element. And then on that parent element, we can do query selector. Since there's only ever going to be one active item, we don't need query selector all here. We can just use query selector. So in that case, we are looking for the active item class. So image-accordion __ item -- active. Now, if you know you're not going to have any collisions, I would recommend just adding an active class name instead of the whole BEM style name here, just because it's quicker to type. But in this case, we have already started down this road, so we will just continue. .class list .remove, and again, we do not need the period here, so we can remove that class that we just looked for and found. So we'll grab that minus the period and paste it in. Let's go ahead and set this to wrap so we can see things a little easier. So that should remove the active class from all the elements that have the active class when one of them is clicked. So we can test that by clicking, and you can see the active class is removed and everything kind of starts taking up the same amount of space. Next, once that's done, we need to add the active class to the element we clicked, which is way easier. So we just do event.target, which is the element we clicked, .ClassList.add, and then we add that active class again. So yeah, I almost hit the period again. We don't need that here. Image-accordion __item active. Okay, so let's save that and let's jump up to the front end. Now, one thing I like to do when working with JavaScript, of course, is open my dev tools and make sure I don't get any weird errors when I start clicking things. So let's just keep that open for a minute and let's click that. Perfect. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now, one thing we're missing is the transition in size. So that's something we can add super easily. Let's jump back into Oxygen. And we can do this via the custom CSS that we've written over here if we wanted to, but I'm just going to do it using the user interface here. I'm going to select the div, make sure we have our image accordion item class selected here. And then what we need to do is go to Advanced Effects Transition, and we need to set a transition duration. And CSS property we'll just set to all because we're not really transitioning anything else. And then timing function. Here I want to have a little bit of fun. I want to show you something called cubic-bezier.com. There are a lot of built-in timing functions. Usually we use ease in out, like this one here. It can be a little stiff. Sometimes you want just something a little bit different. So what we can do is come to cubic-bezier.com and we can play with the easing curve here. So we can actually adjust these nodes to get a different curve. And if we do something like this, we're going to get something pretty similar to ease in out. But we also can go real crazy if we wanted to. And if we hit go, it's going to show you right there. That pink one is the easing that we've just created. Now, it's a bit crazy, but I kind of like it. It goes pretty slow and then speeds up right in the middle and then goes kind of faster. So let's try something like that. Let's copy it up here once we've created the curve that we want. And then we can just go right into Oxygen and paste that into the timing function field. Now, if we save and jump to the front end, we should see that effect. If we click here, you can see that it kind of has that slow at the beginning and end and real fast in the middle effect, which I think looks nice for this type of an element. Now, you can see that on desktop, we're pretty much done here. This looks great, it works great, and should be responsive down to a certain extent. So let's inspect and go into responsive mode. And of course, it jumps straight to where everything looks terrible. This, luckily, is pretty easy to fix. So we're going to go ahead and make this thing responsive. So let's go down to where things start falling apart, which is probably about 768 pixels. And we're going to need to select the repeater here and do a couple of things under advanced. Let's go to size and spacing. We are going to need to give it a height, and then we're going to need to go to layout, do flex column, which of course is going to break everything, don't worry, and then center everything else. Now we need to go to our item and make sure its width is set to 100%, which should bring all our pictures back. Now, another thing we're probably going to need to do is go over to size and spacing and set the height to auto. Now, let's take a peek up here and see, yeah, our height was set on the class, so we can override it with the class. Let's go ahead and save that and look on the front end at what we have here. So this is the behavior on desktop screens and tablets and things that have wider screen real estate. But as we go down, it should go ahead and drop. Now you can see that it's working, but we have some weird kind of overflow stuff going on. That's because our icon's a bit too big. And we also probably need to hide overflow on these elements. So let's jump back into Oxygen and make a few more adjustments. First, let's select our icon. And if you notice, once we add pointer events none to this div, we can't actually click these elements in Oxygen. So what we can do to actually fix that is go to our CSS and make an adjustment here. We can find where we set that to pointer events none, and we can prepend this with body not ng-scope, which will make it only apply on the front end. Now, assuming I didn't miss anything, we can now click these elements and it's working as expected. Now on this breakpoint, I want to reduce the icon size quite a bit. Let's go down to 16, space around icon 4. That looks pretty good. And then I want to select the item itself and make sure we set it to overflow hidden, which is right there. Let's take a look on the front end and see how that looks now. Much better, but our icon is a little too high. Now, why would that be? Probably because of the height of the text and the fact that the icon is centered. So we could do one of two things. We could either reduce the height of the text by giving it more width, which is probably the way to go, or we could uncenter the icon. Now, I kind of like the icon centered. So let's go down here and let's select our text element. And let's set the width to something like, I think we were at 200 pixels before, but let's set it to like 90%. That should bring us down to one line most of the time. And then we also will want this div to be positioned a little closer to the bottom left corner. So let's go to Advanced Layout, Absolute, and we're going to go 8 pixels from the left and 8 pixels from the bottom instead of 16. So let's save that and see if that looks better. There we go. That looks much more reasonable. Now we can still expand these, and this will work on mobile. I did test it on an iPhone to make sure before I recorded the video. This will all work just fine, and it just collapses and does what it needs to responsively. And it only took a couple of minutes to make sure that looked good on phones. So I think that about wraps it up for this element. Again, this is Elijah with the Oxygen team, and that's how to create a dynamic image accordion element in Oxygen using Oxygen's repeater. Thank you very much for watching.